Okay, so on June 28, 1847, Captain Charles Rubidge of Rubidge Street in Peterborough, a few of you have drove maybe the wrong way on that one-way street before, was called before the Select Committee on Immigration at Westminster to give testimony regarding government-assisted emigration to Canada in light of the crisis unfolding during the famine in Ireland. One of the questions he was asked was, will you describe in what way these people were located in the township of Douro and township of Ennismore, whether the Irish emigrants were there kept together as an Irish colony, or whether they were combined with natives of other parts of the empire. Rubidge, one of the earliest settlers and long the government immigration agent in the Peterborough area, replied that that was true. He was then asked what the difference was between those Irish immigrants who settled among British settlers and those who settled together on their own, answering, "I think there is a very great difference. Those who settled in townships partially filled up before with English and Scotch and people from the north of Ireland came into habits of those people and are very much improved." Well, ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you today as a very much unimproved descendant of the Robinson emigrants of 1825. Good afternoon, agus dia duit, Patrick Leahy is Sanam Dome, and I'm going to talk to you today about Irish and Canadian, two competing and sometimes complementary identities that developed and were engaged with by the Robinson settlers in the Peterborough area, in the communities they formed, among their descendants and the descendants of those communities that they attracted to them in the century from 1825 to about 1918. And we're going to look at these conflicting and complementary identities at times of crisis. And we're going to use that lens of crisis to see when these things bubble to the surface and what those communities and the members of those communities choose to do about it. The three main types of crisis, at times of crisis, we're going to look at are in 1837 to 38, a rebellion at that point. We're going to look at flashpoints in the 1860s with the rise of the Fenian Brotherhood. And we're going to conclude generally in the conscription crisis during the First World War, 1917 to 1918. So we can move ahead to the next slide there, Sean. Thank you. So that was a map there before, just showing some of the geographic areas that the communities where they developed around Peterborough, Douro, Ennismore, Downeyville, the most distinct, separate from the city of Peterborough, which developed, but distinct communities which have retained their Irish character to this day. And like we were talking about earlier, Dr. Jay was mentioning, and Dr. Jay McGaughey is some as well, there was a tradition that the people who came to Canada in 1823 and 25 were coming out of with agrarian violence, and in that tradition there was a real strong sense of the primacy of local identity. At times of great crisis, then we've heard James Donnelly was referenced already, and he states in Captain Rock, the inhabitants of a particular locality, and especially the poor, had a superior or even exclusive claim over that of outsiders to the land, employment, and food available within that locality. So in these times of crisis, that circle, the circle which you trust, the circle with which you engage in, it tightens tremendously. And that circle, that belief in the local thing being the most valuable and most trustworthy is the circle which people came to Canada with that belief that that local strength is that which they could most rely upon. So seasonal workers were often coming in from other counties, a common practice at the time, and they were viewed with hostility in the early 1820s. With a Rockite notice issued in County Cork in March of 1823, as we heard earlier, warning, "I do tell any strangers or Kerrymen or Limerick men to be off immediately. Times of shortage in land, work, or money, the people of the place took first claim to the resources of that place. When desperation knocked, the circle of those who were trusted contracted to the local." The resistance to those deemed outsiders continued on into 1824, and in East Cork, a landowner was warned to discharge the strange and deluded foreigners that you're collecting and keeping as it were in opposition to the law of our country. Now be certain that we are fully bent and determined to allow no such proceedings in this neighborhood like all other places. So we're seeing that people leaving here from the disturbed times with a very much sense that that which is local belongs to them, and they are going to protect their own with that. In hard times, local food, money, land, and work were to stay with them locally. And so we see that desire. We'll move ahead in the slide. Desire to be with those of your locality, it translated to their settlement locations in Canada. In Douro, for example, roughly 60 families settle in the township, and I know that the font's hard to see there, but those 60 families, roughly 70% of them, if you cast a circle just south of Mitchelstown here, about a 15-kilometer radius of that. 70% of those families were from that radius. They knew each other, they trusted each other, they're comfortable with each other. If we look over to Ennismore, there was 110 people who left from Kerry in 1825. All 110 of them settled in Ennismore, as well as 3 families from Cape Clear Island. People from the periphery of the catchment area here of that emigration, they went to Ennismore, as well as other people. But what we saw is distinct local communities taking shape that were influenced by the local communities here that the people came from. And that sense of local is going to carry on as they go forward. And so now we're going to move into our first crisis point, a crisis of loyalty, perhaps, as Jay McGaughey referenced. And we'll move forward in our slides, Sean. The rebellion of 1837-38. There is, in response to the Family Compact, who we heard from earlier, there's a desire for rebellion, for reform, and agitation towards a more American-style government. The Family Compact pushes back, obviously, against this, and calls out militia against William Lyon Mackenzie's uprising, which takes place in 1837. And, possibly surprising, there's a great turnout of militia from among the Robinson settlers. They've been kept on board by the Robinson brothers and by others. They've been protected by government, and 13 years on from settlement, they do feel debts of obligation to the government. So we see a number of names here, family names, some ancestors of people who are in the room here today who went out. And yet, another thing to be said, some of these militia duties were rather light. They were border garrisons, and it was a way to make cash through the winter. But at the same time, there was a desire here. They were willing to serve alongside Crown forces in 1837 and 38, and they were willing to push back against that more American Republican style of reform that was being advocated for. We'll move forward again in our slides. So at that point, that crisis, 37-38, our Irish identities are holding true with those who looked after us, who looked to the Robinsons in this case. So we're moving forward to 1844, and we're drawing people to Douro, to Ennismore, to Downeyville, and to points all around from the communities here, from the communities that they left. Relatives are coming, family members are coming. An example here, a nice letter that was preserved from, it was to Pat Ryan at Ballyclaw up in Limerick, and it's from his brother Dennis, who's living in Asphodel near Norwood. And he says, "I received your letter dated 14th of October, stated to me that you were for coming out later." And he goes on and talks about Morley Lynch and Mrs. Lynch and James Lynch families. Danny, those are your wife's ancestors. Make sure you report back to her on that. As well as Michael Shaughnessy, brother and sister Aldwell. And so what we're saying is we've built a community. We know here in Canada we've brought a community along with us that you know at home. And there's this engagement back and forth. And we're using that, the people in Canada are using that to draw along and to give confidence to their relatives to join them. There's a lot of positivity at this point. Note the year, 1844. "Dear brother, I'm giving you as much intelligence as I possibly can in order to keep you from expense." He gives a lot of tips along the way in the letter. "Remember me to all the friends and let me know how they are." And so Pat Ryan does come along the following year with his family. And Brian, back there, you're a descendant of him as well. So these letters, it's neat. I always find to take these letters and find living people in them from these sources and attach them. Now we can bring it forward to ourselves here in 2025. So we're going to move forward to our next slide, and we're moving into a turbulent period. As we move forward there, Sean. We're moving into the 1860s. In the 1860s, we are seeing the beginnings of some change. The Family Compact is out in Canada. The Orange Order is ascendant. In Ireland, the Fenian movement is afoot. And as we were learning earlier, John O'Mahony, born at Clonakilla, founded the Fenian Brotherhood in 1858 and moves to New York, from which they're headquartered. With ties of close geography and kinship, Roberts from Mitchelstown as well, and O'Mahony's Fenian activities in the U.S. would certainly have been followed with interest in the Peterborough area. So there's a very volatile situation beginning to form, and yet the Orange Order in the Peterborough area is strongly ascendant. And the Peterborough Examiner, for example, in light of recent St. Patrick's Day parades put on by Irish Catholics, they run an article on the front page, March 1865, titled "A Portrait of the Irish Roman Catholics," stating, and we'll look at their fine print there, stating, "The following remarkable and clever acrostic was written by a gentleman during the rebellion of 1798, who shared in the stirring events of that time. If the first word of each line be read from the top to bottom, it will be found to give the moral lesson which it suggests," and it reads, "Let a papist have sway, and his king he'll betray, bound fast in a chain, he is faithful again." And so that's a heavy thing, and that's a heavy thing if you're living in Douro and Ennismore and Downeyville to be seeing that on the front page of the paper the largest newspaper servicing your community. And in response, I think there's a turn to protecting themselves, protecting their own again. On June 23rd, 1863, a St. Patrick's Society is formed in Douro. As we can see on this slide, this is the treasurer's book for said society. These were organized in fraternal groups which were meant to provide a counterbalance to the Orange Order. Peterborough Society had organized an ill-fated parade in March 1863, which the Orange Order had stopped at Cannon Point with a cannon mounted on a sleigh in the snow. In Douro, processions were held on March 17th. Small annual dues were collected, and meetings were held annually after their procession in the Douro Town Hall. The treasurer's book for the society has survived in the collection of William Moher. Moher, born in Kilworth in 1828, emigrated as a child with his family in 1831 to Douro, where they settled alongside relatives and acquaintances from this area where we are now. They were a large active family, and they kept engaged in many farming and business activities and kept extensive records, and we're lucky that they have survived. In this treasurer's book, we see the names of 55 men paying dues from 1863 to 65. And again, 67% of them were Robinson emigrants from 1825 or their sons. Most of the others arrived in Douro in the period before 1845. By location of origin, 29 of them were from Mitchelstown, and about 15 or so from the general area around here. Very few were not connected to this, again, tight local circle. Ages ranged from young men in their 20s, such as Patrick Ryan, born in Fermoy in 1843, to 71-year-old Roger Fahy, who was born in 1792 and had served in the army. Much of the Douro militia of 1837, who we saw earlier, now they're listed here, or their relatives, their sons, a decided move away from the outright loyalty to the crown displayed in 1837, including the militia's captain James Hogan and Sergeant Condon. So mixed in with this membership list, we'll go to the next slide, Sean, is a tantalizing fragment of a letter draft. I should also like to know how far you are living from Rochester and Buffalo. You'll please direct your letter to Peterborough instead of South Douro. There'll be less danger of any other person getting it. Direct to William Moher Sr. Now you can imagine when I found this, I would certainly have loved to have seen the top half of the letter, but this is just the draft, and the top half must have been thrown away in the 1860s. But there's certain possibilities come to mind. Rochester and Buffalo were both centers of Fenian activity at this time. Rochester was linked to the Peterborough area by a ferry across Lake Ontario from Cobourg. A Fenian invasion landing at Cobourg from Rochester was feared through the 1860s. A government informant wrote to Attorney General John A. Macdonald in September 1866, noting, Sean, slide, I have noticed lately a great many strangers coming from Rochester by the steamer Corinthian and going either to Peterborough or Lindsay by rail, and whose appearance would indicate the parties to be subordinate officers of the so-called Fenian Brotherhood, doubtless organizing Fenian circles among the Irish Catholics in the rural districts of Peterborough and Lindsay. So clearly, Rochester was a local source of contact with the American Fenian movement for Irish Catholics in the wider area, while Buffalo was a staging ground for the Fenian invasion. Although our exact addressee and context is missing to that letter fragment, William Moher and the Douro St. Patrick's Society were most likely engaging to some degree with the wider Fenian movement, seeing what their options should be given where the proposed invasion may land. Furthermore, in late September of 1966, again following the failed Fenian invasions that took place in June, Aaron Maguire made a clandestine tour through the Peterborough region under orders from the government of Canada West to scout out Fenian sympathizers. He reported, I've made a tour through the township of Ops, Emily, we'll go back there, through the townships of Ops, Emily, Ennismore, and Douro, and have spent some time in Otonabee, Dummer, and other townships. My observations confirm the statement made in Ottawa, that the people are in sympathy with the movement to overthrow British rule in Ireland. I do not say that all exhibit this feeling. On the contrary, the more intelligent do not yet. Yet these are vastly in the minority. Now, read into that what you may. Yet I have not been able to find a single legal association. So there's a gray area here. About the 1st of August, a meeting was organized a few miles from Lindsay by some rascal from the U.S. for the purpose of drilling some of the youth of Ops. Most of all the party concerned have now gone across the line. An attempt was made to raise a volunteer force for the government in Ennismore after the Fort Erie Fenian raid, carries on the letter, and not 5 young men volunteered out of a quota of 50, while the following day, 38 left for the U.S. to join the Fenians. Still many of these are now again back to their homes. So as McGuire's pointing out, general sentiment in the area is in favor of a violent uprising to achieve independence in Ireland. It was attempted in 1867 here, and puts them in line with the O'Mahony wing of the Fenians, as opposed to the Roberts wing, which wanted to invade Canada. A family link, possibly between the 1825 Mahonys of Mitchelstown and the relatives who followed them out, would make an interesting study to pursue further. At the same time, a number of young men in Ennismore joined the Fenians in upstate New York, and it represents a strong change from that of the 1830s, when Irish Catholic men in the Peterborough area gladly served in militia companies supporting the government. An organized movement towards Irish independence and the rise in Orange aggression goes some way towards explaining the rise in Irish nationalism in the communities founded by the Robinson settlers. But on a more visceral level, I think the impact of the Great Famine was highly significant in hardening attitudes against British rule in Ireland. So a document regarding famine deaths here in 1847 in Kilworth brings it into focus, how impactful that situation was to the Robinson families and their neighbors in the Peterborough area. This document, compiled by Lord Mountcashel, who we've talked about earlier today, was applying for food aid at the Port of Cove, aid that had been sent from Boston, and he has the priests compile a list of people who had died in 1847 up to June from the parish, and there's 117 names on that list. And I go through that list, I go through them, and what do I find? I find numerous ties to families who came to Peterborough. There's 5 or 6 Mohers dead in 1847 at Kilworth. There's Heffernans, again, in that list. There's McGuire's, there's Geary's, there's a number of names there that all connect to Robinson emigrants and the others who followed them, with the cousins who stayed behind dying here at Kilworth. And we know that there were people, John Heffernan, who went to Canada, went back to live at Kilworth, and then returns to Canada in 1847 after a relative of his dies. They're bringing this news with them, and I think much as we see across Ireland, in the wider diaspora, there is a hardening of attitudes, a greater desire for independence, and a resentment towards the massive British mishandling of the famine in the time. And those deaths that we have listed so close by to where we are here today really drove that home for those in the Peterborough area. And so we're going to move on then from that point where the Irish and Canadian identities are really starting to rub, and we're going to go to maybe the most delicate and sensitive topic we're going to look at today, and that's during the First World War. In Canada, obviously we're still part of the British Empire at this point, though we have achieved some degree of independence. We enter the war as along with the rest of the British Empire, and many young men from Douro, from Ennismore, from Downeyville and the area around Peterborough gladly served with distinction. A number of relatives of my own, for example, there's some served at Vimy and at Passchendaele, all of them sharing O'Leary ancestors here from Kilbenny that left in 1825. And yet at the same time, something happens. 1917 election comes along, and they don't have enough manpower. Conscription is proposed, and as in many places, conscription is opposed by many who don't want to see forced service. In Quebec, that's certainly the case, and a tight election is fought, which has the government kind of engaging heavily with the Orange Order to promote conscription and to kind of show Catholics in Quebec and elsewhere who oppose conscription to be disloyal. The government wins, and then they proceed to break an election promise that was that all farmers' sons would be exempted from conscription. So then at this point, all young men are supposed to return to report for duty, and certainly we have in oral tradition and recorded interviews in Douro and Ennismore, in Downeyville. At this point, there is a refusal to serve for those who don't see it as their war. Certainly in Ireland, there's a move for independence is heavily afoot at this point. The promise to the farmers and their sons has been broken, and much like through that century leading to this point, the primacy of local comes into place. The communities hide these young men who choose not to fight in a war that they don't see as their own. For example, here in the middle of this map, there's a big swamp, and in that swamp there's an island. And I was up there building a fence a couple of weeks ago. And in that island, young men from the community, they went through that summer of 1917 winter of 17 into 18, and they lived on that island. At night, they would come out and they would bring in farmers' hay, they would cut their grain for them, and the community would bring them food and blankets. In Ennismore as well, they would go across the water to their cousins in Downeyville. If the military police were raiding in Ennismore, those men in Ennismore go to Downeyville and vice versa. Men wore dresses to work in the field so that they would escape patrols. And yet at the same time, there's two identities being held by the same community. There's great pride in those who chose and made the decision to fight in that war. And at the same time, the community would protect those who chose and said, this is not our war to fight. We're not going to do that. And I think that ability to hold an Irish and a Canadian identity at that time has really come into play. But overall, that there's the through line of a local primacy, a loyalty to that local thing which they left here with in 1825 as being the most important component completely to these people. So that is the through line that I've found as we look at Irish and Canadian, two competing identities that have flared up in times of crisis through the 19th century into the early 20th century. And something that I think really brings it home was on this gravestone here. It was erected by Roger Fahy in memory of his son, James Fahy. And it says, a native of Tipperary, it's in memory of James Fahy of Douro, a native of Tipperary, Ireland. He's a person of two places. He is a person of Ireland, he is a person of Canada, and that's memorialized there, both of his identities in one place, in an Irish style of stone, carved in Canada for somebody who crossed the ocean himself and found an early grave for a young man there. So that is my presentation here to you today, that there was an Irish and Canadian identity that developed through the 19th century, that surpassed any competing claims to that was this desire to be accountable, to be loyal to the local community around you, and to engage with this local community. And that's what I think all of us have come here. We've come to events across North America, from across North America to Canada this year. We've come now to Ireland. We're still feeling some of that community, that tight, close-knit community that left here in 1825 or 23, and those values still hold true to us today. And that's drawn us across the ocean to here today. Thank you.